All right, y'all. So I wanna real quick. I just wanna touch on in terms of like getting rid of negative thoughts, right? How we are to rid ourselves of negative thoughts. First of all, it's not a on and off switch. It's not a silver bullet. It's not something that could be remedied instantaneously, like, you know, pop it in a microwave and in a few minutes it pops out. It's not like that. Your negative thoughts is a result of years and years upon years, even generationally. It's not just, see, your negative thoughts don't just come from you. It's also generational. Your negative thoughts is a series of historical thought patterns that were carried by your forefathers, your parents, your grandparents, so on and so forth, and passed on to you. No different than your genes, your traits, and so on and so forth. So a lot of us got to understand we inherited our thoughts from our parents. They inherited their thoughts from their grandparents, and so on and so forth, and the cycle continues. No different than your genes, right? If you are you have a stature that's tall, typically that means you inherited that from someone in your family, your mom, your dad, the great grandparents. You know, if you have brown or blue eyes or whatever, you get my point. Thoughts are the same way. You know, how many times, think about it, as a child, how many times your parents told you couldn't do something, therefore you took that in psychologically, and you inhibited your own growth without even knowing that it came from your mom or your dad or your great-grandparents or your grandparents. So thoughts are something that is inherited, no different than genes are inherited. That's one, okay? Now, your thoughts can be compounded, right? It can be inherited, but it also can be compounded. It can be compounded now by your surroundings, right? It can be compounded by the environment in which you find yourself. It can be compounded by a series of rejections and failures and so on and so forth. So thoughts can be inherited, usually are inherited, and therefore, and later on compounded. And it can be compounded by the environment or by yourself, right? Sometimes we self-prophesy, like we speak things into existence. We speak the negativity and then we manifest it, and therefore we self-prophesy. So all these different mechanisms are responsible for our thoughts, right? That's on a superficial level. Now let's go a little deeper with it and dig deeper. Your thoughts are a direct correlation or a result of the electrical currents that's flowing through your body. What I mean by that is your brain has what's called a synapses. Synapses is the area in which it's areas in which the brain forms networks, right? We have billions of neurons in the brain, and these neurons form networks. The synapse is the point at which these neurons meet and form a network, okay? The way your thoughts are generated is a result of electrical impulses. So the electrical impulses that are generated by the SA node or synode, which is the heart's pacemaker. Think of a pacemaker, an artifact that man made. It is a spin-off of the synode. Synode is responsible for the pulsating of your heart. So every time your heart pulsates, you give off electrical charges. Now, the foods that you eat, potassium, magnesium, calcium, all these different elements have electrical charges. So when we ingest or when we get these foods into our systems, we're also taking in these electrical currents, right? Because if you go to the periodic table and you look at elements, all these different elements have their own unique charge. So we're naturally taking in the charges by the foods that we eat. And if you think about it, a lot of us don't eat really healthy foods, right? So let's just, you know, leave that on the shelf, because that's pretty much a fact, right? Most of us, not all, most. So the foods that we eat are bringing in these charges into our bodies. Now, once those foods are broken down, those electrical charges are actually being transmitted to our brain, right? By means of the electrical impulse of our heart, right? So when those charges are now being transferred to our brain, and the synaptic network of our brain pretty much uses those charges to generate what's called the electrical impulses of the neurons. And those electrical impulses are what's responsible for our movement, right? Our bodily movement, our behavior, and as well as our thought patterns. That's the metaphysics or the scientific scientific explanation of how thoughts are generated. So I just gave you the natural, right, historical explanation of how we inherit our thoughts from our parents and forefathers, so on and so forth. But then also they're also compounded, right, with contemporary times. And then I'm explaining to you the scientific and metaphysical and electromagnetic radiations and spectrums and so on and so forth, how the nature of the thought, the nature itself of the thought. Now, the important thing is once you understand the nature of the thought, which is you have the historical context, right? Then you understand the nature, which is the properties and the ingredients of the thought. The electrical currents encouraged and aided, bedded, and assisted by the foods that we're eating. Well, we know to change our thoughts, then we have to change our diet. Right? That's facts. We got to start eating healthier foods, and we have to do our research. We have to read up on the elements, the minerals. Every element has its own unique atomic value, which gives it a certain charge, so we can figure out what kind of charge this is. It's a lot of work, folks. I understand, but it's your own health, so you're worth more. You're worth the work. That's one. Two. Well, that I should have did it in this order. First, you got to understand where your history, right? You got to understand kind of like, okay, so this started with my mom, or it started with my dad, or I got this from my great grandparent, or I got this from my grandmother, or this trait, this idea. Where's the inception of this idea about me hating myself, or the self-hate, the self-loathing that a lot of us black people suffer from, fear and self-loathing. We suffer that, right? We hate our own skin. Where does this come from? We got to see, okay, did this come through what line, what lineage did this come from? And when we start to re-engineer, right? When we start to reverse engineer the process, then we can get to the root. Once we get to the root, okay, now we have conscious and awareness. Once you have conscious awareness, you now liberated yourself, right? The battle is not over, but you have won at least half. Now the next half is, again, go to the foods that we're eating and putting in our bodies. A lot of these foods are genetically and chemically and biologically and biotechnologically engineered. So we got to understand that, right? So once we do all of these things, we can start reverse re-engineering our psyche and our thought process. Once we do that, then we can elevate. Then we can free ourselves from the mental enslavement, the emancipation, like Bob Marley said, you know, the song by Bob Marley where they say, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. You know, none can free ourselves, none can free our minds but ourselves, right? And those are some powerful words. We hold the key to unlock the psychological box that they've locked us in. So let's unlock ourselves till next time. Mark, you know what I'm going to be doing, cooking these books, giving a whole new meaning.